So the story I'm going to tell you this morning actually came from a program called Timeline, written by James Stewart on Vermont Public Radio. And they are little segments of music history and stories of composers that they played during their classical music broadcasts. Has music ever changed the world? Can culture hold the people together? Every 5 years, the Estonian people gather on their festival grounds. This beautiful amphitheater with thousands of seats and expansive fields for an audience. They come from all corners of the country, young and old, dressed in traditional Estonian clothes. They aren't there to cheer on a sporting event or for a political rally. They come to the Laulupidu, the singing festival. The festival began in 1869 with 800 male singers, and 70 years later, in 1938, it had grown to a mixed chorus of all ages of 12,000 people. This was the last festival before World War II began. The director of that festival was a man named Gustav Onsite, and we'll talk about him more later. So here we go. This is a current map, and I want to show you that Estonia is that tiny little brown dot below Finland. And Latvia and Lithuania, the other Baltic states, are right under there. And that is currently Russia and the Soviet Union, and you will see another map a little bit later when things changed. Estonia is a small country of about 1.2 million citizens, about the size of the population of Dallas. It's there between the Baltic Sea and Russia. It is said that the Estonians have inhabited this land for over 5,000 years. In the course of millennia, they have seen many hardships, conflicts, and occupations, and yet this culture, rich in music, has survived despite near eradication in the 20th century. Just a little history here. In 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which promised non-aggression between those two countries. Days after signing, Germany invaded Poland, and the events leading up to World War II began. An important part of this pact was a secret protocol that set physical boundaries dividing Europe between the Nazis and the Soviets. And according to this agreement, Stalin now had claim to all of the Baltic states. Within days, thousands of Soviet troops entered Estonia. In one night, over 10,000 people, a third of them children, were arrested and shipped to Siberia. Only fewer than half of them actually ever returned to the country. The Soviets targeted politicians, teachers, artists. Anyone with any influence was either arrested or executed. The Estonians call 1940 the year of suffering. But that was only the beginning. In 1941, the very next year, Germany broke the pact with Russia and invaded Russia, taking over the occupation of Estonia. Those who had aided the Soviets now were arrested or executed by the Germans, and the young men were forced into the German army. And only 3 years later, when Germany was forced to retreat, the Soviets came back with a vengeance. And those who had aided the Nazis were now called enemies of the state. Over 70,000 people fled the country or died trying, or were again deported to the gulags, our friend Gustav Onsite among them. So that's what it looked like now. In 1945, as the war was coming to an end, Stalin promised that there would be free elections in Estonia, but they never did that. By the end of the war, a quarter of the population was gone, and the Iron Curtain fell on the people of Estonia for 45 years of Soviet occupation. One of the goals of Stalin's regime was to bring uniformity across a vast territory that was now under Soviet control. Russification is the term that is used to describe the cultural assimilation that was taking place. Russian citizens would come by the thousands and be sent to settle in occupied territories, to influence local politics, and to crush independent movements, an attempt at cultural genocide. Does that sound familiar? That's what's happening in Ukraine. In Estonia, the practice of Laulupidu, the 5-year national singing festival, could not be silenced even by the Soviets. In 1947, Stalin allowed the country to organize and participate in their first festival since the beginning of the war. However, they wanted to control every aspect that they could. Soviet propaganda declared that the Laulupidu was a celebration of the Estonian people, thanking Stalin for his support and contributions. You get the idea. The Estonians were forbidden to wear traditional clothes. They were told what to sing, most of which was in Russia, including the Russian national anthem. It was only at the very end of that singing festival that the participants were allowed to share their own traditional songs, just a few. And this year, there was a new song. The famous Estonian conductor, Gustav Ernst, had composed a new song while in Soviet prison, and the lyrics were a well-known Estonian poem called Mu isamaa minu, My Fatherland is My Love. There, in the midst of the Soviet occupation, under the watchful eyes of Soviet guards, thousands of Estonians broke into song, declaring their love for their sacred ancestral land. Well, somehow, the piece had escaped the Soviet censors. It's said in the Estonian language. It isn't very long, but immediately this song became the unofficial national anthem for a country and a people desperate to hold on to their history and their identity. It was subsequently banned. Yeah, forbidden to be performed again. By 1969, Estonia was set to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Laulupidu. Again, the Soviets allowed the gathering, but only under strict controls. No traditional garb, no singing of the fatherland is my home. The festival proceeded as planned. All the songs were sung and everything was over. However, the choirs and the audience refused to leave. All on their own, they started singing, Mu isamaa minu. No conductor, no orchestra, just thousands of voices desperate to sing this message at this moment. The Soviets reacted by having a big brass band start to play, trying to drown out all the voices. But they failed, as the Estonians took up the call and sang the song over and over and over again. As one participant in the festival shared, if you have 20,000 people start to sing one song, you really can't shut them up. The Soviets were forced to call the composer, Gustav Ernst, to the stage to lead the people in a final performance of this song. This declaration that the Estonian people and culture was not dead. Despite the Soviet ban, the singing of that song became the finale for all festival programs to this day. Now, I don't want to play fast and loose here with 50 years of Baltic, Soviet, and Russian history, but I'm going to tell you a few stories of what went on in the next 2 decades. After Stalin's death, leadership gradually changed within the Soviet Union, with internal forces of influence split between the Politburo of the Communist Party and the KGB. The 80s found Gorbachev's policies of reform, glasnost, and perestroika moving to the forefront. The people of the Baltic states began to speak out in protest. In one very specific instance, the USSR announced a new strip mining project for phosphorite, the mining of which had been polluting the air and water of Estonia for many decades. And the protests and demonstrations forced the project to close. Inspired by this success, the people of Estonia continued to speak the truth of their past, their heritage, and their oppression that they were experiencing. They spoke and they sang. In June of 1988, around 100,000 Estonians gathered for 5 nights of nonviolent protest and singing. The songs were political and patriotic anthems. One night during these gatherings, an individual drove by on a motorbike with the Estonian flag waving behind him. This was the first time in 50 years that the Estonian flag had been displayed freely and openly. The next night, dozens of flags were on display as the people sang, and they waved their flags back and forth to the music. So this marked the beginning of the so-called singing revolution, a revolution not of bloodshed or conflict, killing or destruction, but of singing and a smile. With unified purpose, the Estonian people began to push harder for their independence. In September of that same year, they organized another demonstration at the Singing Festival grounds. This time, 300,000 people were in attendance. That's about a third of the entire Estonian population. There were no weapons, only speaking and singing, and this was their power. Through their raised voices, they demanded a return to Estonian nationalism, political freedom, and a restoration of their language and flag. August of 1989 was the 50th anniversary of that infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which the Soviet Union still used as justification to occupy these countries. On August 23rd, almost 2 million people joined hands in a human chain that stretched for 425 miles, connecting the capitals of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Can you imagine? The event was called the Baltic Way and was a peaceful protest against what all the citizens called illegal occupation. After the successful protest of the Baltic Way, Estonia was emboldened to take even more risky steps toward independence. They registered their own citizens, elected their own parliament, and began to exert their own executive power. Well, this angered the Soviets, especially the ones who were part of the Russification program. They organized their own anti-independent movement and demonstrated, and the Soviet army came to help them break down the gates and let them occupy the capital courtyard and grounds. Well, the Estonians responded by coming to the Capitol building and surrounding it with even larger numbers than the Russians inside. It was a very tense moment. But instead of a fight, the Estonians provided a way for their opponents to leave peacefully. They parted the sea, if you will. They held hands and they started singing their national songs of independence. The outnumbered Russians had no choice but to walk peacefully and quietly through the sea of voices, and no blood was spilt. The great USSR was beginning to dissolve for many economic and political reasons, former member states declaring they were no longer part of the Soviet Union. This led to violence in Lithuania and Latvia, but Estonia declared their independence immediately, hoping to avoid armed conflict. The Soviet forces came anyway, quickly moving across the country and exerting their control. The Estonian citizens rushed to protect their important radio and TV towers, their main source of information, and they stood in the path of Soviet troops. No guns, no weapons, just their presence to block the way. When hope seemed all but lost, suddenly it was over. Boris Yeltsin was elected the Russian president, and he displaced Gorbachev, the Soviet premier, and announced that Russia, the largest and most important member state of the Soviet Union, was seceding. Suddenly, there was no USSR. There was no Soviet army. The tanks belonged to Russia, and Yeltsin called them home. The Soviet Union dissolved in just days, and Estonia is now an independent nation, eventually joining NATO in 2004. In 1994, the first celebration after the restoration of independence was the 125th anniversary of the Laulupidu. Today, the festival continues as it did throughout the occupation, in spite of Soviet rule. Every 5 years, they held that festival 11 times. 11 times before they gained their independence. The 26th Song Festival with 1,020 choirs and over 40,000 singers, dancers, and musicians from all around the world was held in 2019. On the festival grounds in Tallinn, there is a statue of the composer-conductor Gustav Ernsax, who wrote that unofficial anthem, and he still watches over the proceedings. The Estonians get together, sing what they want, and wear what they want. They won their freedom through peaceful protest and singing. They saved their folk songs, their traditions, their language, and their culture with the power of their music.